There is an ancient proverb of old Terran descent that the rats are the first to abandon a sinking vessel. These lowly rodents and their frantic base instinct sense the encroaching doom long before the pride of man allows for such realisation. Their small nature and limited intellect are, in this instance, a blessing. They do not possess the capacity to belittle a threat, nor do they harbour the delusion that they are above the laws of nature. They see the end, and they flee to preserve the spark of their wretched lives. In contrast, consider the master of the ship, mankind. When the damp begins to rise beneath his boots, he does not see the herald of his extinction. He sees an inconvenience. He views the seeping brine through the lens of an unearned superiority, convinced that his steel and his station render him immune to the hungers of the tide. He scoffs at the superstition of the fleeing rats, standing tall upon the deck, even as the wood groans in agony. But the water is indifferent to his titles. The damp rises with a sudden suffocating speed, and before the prayer can leave his lips or the command be shouted to the engine room, the ship is claimed. Humanity, draped in the heaving robes of its own hubris, sinks into the crushing dark. In the subject of today's chronicle, it is not the vermin or the rats who serves the heralds of the sinking ship. That role falls to a vile Xenos race known as the Chromes, a deceptively simple name for a race of metallic insectoids. Though their kind has since been purged from the galaxy, rendered extinct by the cleansing fire of the Imperium, the cost of that victory, if it can even be called such a thing given the aftermath, was apocalyptic. For in 544 M32, during a time of supposed Imperial stability, following the recent scouring of the Chaos traitors at the end of the Horus Heresy, these xenoforms were identified as a potential threat to Holy Terror itself. They moved with a frantic swarming momentum, leaping from world to world in a desperate migration. In his staggering arrogance, Lord High Admiral Langsam, then the most powerful man in the fractious High Lords Council and, at least on paper, in charge of the defence of the Segmentum Solar. He interpreted this movement as a direct offensive, dismissing the frantic council of his own entourage and ignoring the vox patterns and signals that suggested these creatures were not attacking, but fleeing. Langsung, obsessed with the theatre of power and the optics of a grand victory, dispatched a vast armada. To ensure the complete annihilation of this apparent threat, he committed the entire shield company from the Imperial Fists, the Praetorians of Terra themselves, who were still adjusting to their vastly reduced chapter strength, complying with the newly written Codex Astartes. For Langsam, he believed that a threat to the throne world was a threat to his own prestige, and such a thing would brook no quarter. And so the die was cast. The fleeing rats were ignored, and the true threat, a darkness so profound it would nearly extinguish the light of the Emperor himself, continued to rise unseen in the cold void. It was hidden not by xenotechnology or warp-bomb sorcery, but by the impenetrable veil of human vanity. And thus I present my next penned work, a study into the lethal arrogance of man and the catastrophic repercussions of false supremacy. A history of the War of the Beast. In the middle centuries of the 32nd millennia, the Imperium of Man drifted through a gilded age known to the history books as the Time of Rebirth. It was an era of deceptive tranquility, a golden age of reclamation where the nightmares of the Horus Heresy had finally begun to fade into the fog of myth. The traitor legions were believed to be broken in the scouring efforts of the Loyalists and were left rotting in the madness of the Eye of Terror, while the myriad of Xenos threats that once contested the Great Crusade were thought to be extinguished or relegated to the primitive fringes of the galaxy. The stifling dogmatic zealotry and the rotting superstition that would come to define the later millennia had not fully calcified within the human spirit. Mankind, in its staggering and perhaps inevitable hubris, believed the stars were finally, irrevocably, tamed. Chief among these lethal delusions was the dismissal of the Ork. The High Lords and the war savants of the Senatorum Imperialis looked upon the ancient records of the Ullanor Crusade and saw a finality that did not exist. They believed the Greenskins had been broken forever by the Warmaster Horus's monumental victory, finding purchase, perhaps, in their own propaganda, if they had forfeited the right to any insight. Their hands were too stained by the pursuit of petty influence to grasp the magnitude of the coming storm. Having traded their strategic foresight for the squalid currencies of the court, these masters of the Imperium found themselves blind. To grant them understanding now would be to cast pearls before swine. For those who have spent a lifetime ignoring the shadows forfeit the privilege of understanding the monsters that dwell within. They firmly held on to the notion that the backs of the Xenos beast had been snapped and its spirit scattered into the void. Consequently, the vast bulk of the Imperial fleet was permitted to drift to the far-flung frontiers under the command of the High Lord Admiral Langsung. He utilised the Navy more as a tool for his own political prestige than as a shield for the core worlds, as was his duty. For those who do not know, since such a title is beyond the scope of even a planetary governor, there exists only 5 High Lord Admirals in the entirety of the Emperor's domain, one for each of the great segmenti majoris. Each of these august individuals is the absolute sovereign of their void within their allotted portion of the galaxy, overseeing the naval strength of 1,000 sectors. Yet even amongst these titans, there is a shadow of precedence. While all 5 hold equal rank, the High Lord Admiral Solar is traditionally viewed as the most prestigious office. They stand as the guardian of the substantial volumes of space surrounding Holy Terra itself. So you can see then, dearest listeners, that Langsung was in direct dereliction of his duties. Sending the fleets to the far-flung corners of the galaxy left the heart of the Imperium and Holy Terra itself guarded only by the thin veil of tradition and the arrogance of a race that thought its greatest wars were behind it. This false sense of supremacy would soon meet a violent end on the world of Ardumantia. Located amidst 6 solar weeks of warp travel from the throne world, Ardumantia was the site of the supposed routine pacification. As mentioned, the entire shield company of the Imperial Fist chapter, formerly the 7th Legion, the Praetorians of Terra, and the lineage of the Primarch Rogel Dawn had been dispatched to eradicate the Xenos forms known as the Chromes. These metallic insectoids were estimated by strategic surveys to number in the tens of billions, and their frantic, multi-directional migration towards Segmentum Solar was misinterpreted as a calculated offensive. The Imperium, blinded by its own martial pride, saw an invading army, but they should have seen a panicked exodus. The reality was far more terrifying. The Chromes were not attacking, they were fleeing a predator so vast it is said to have cast a shadow across the warp itself. As the Imperial Fist made landfall and began their righteous genocide, closing the noose upon the insectoids, Adamantia was suddenly convulsed by impossible gravitational storms that defied the standard laws of physics. The Chromes, driven by a primal instinctive terror of the doom following them, threw themselves at the Imperial lines in a suicidal frenzy that overwhelmed even the disciplined boltifiers of the Astartes. The Imperial Fists were decimated in the initial surge. The fleet was shattered in orbit, and Master Chapter Cassius Marin fell to the Xenos swarm, a casualty of the war that humanity still did not fully understand. Desperate to contain the spill of billions of these insectoids towards the throne world, the High Lords, with the stark cold endorsement of the Grand Master of Assassins, Draken Van Gorich, ordered a massive rescue mission led by the Lord Commander Militant Heth, along with the full remaining strength of the Imperial Fist chapter to salvage the situation and ensure the cordon of the system. Terra must not be threatened. They arrived after the harrowing warp translation to find not a conventional war zone, but the site of a reality-warping apocalypse. The true architect of the gravitic anomalies had finally revealed itself. A massive artificial planetoid, one that has been labelled in the archives as a Ork attack moon. Such a monstrosity has never been witnessed by the Imperium prior to that dark hour, and in nearly 10 millennia that have followed since the climatic ending of the War of the Beast, no such horror has defiled our stars again. In the deepest archives within the vaults of my homeworld's chapter, I have unearthed fragmented scraps of data regarding these constructions. Descriptions so profound in their violation of the natural law that I find myself praying to he who sits upon the golden throne that they are exaggerations of a broken mind. Yet, as I sit in the silence of my scriptorum, I know in my heart that they are not. This record serves as a grim testament against the lethality of underestimation. As I noted in my previous chronicle, the Greenskins is a biological engine capable of strange and arcane industry if left to fester. But this is something else entirely. This was not the work of savages, but the manifestation of a primal manufactured genius, a weapon that did not merely contest a world, but made it by its very presence. These moons stand as a harrowing monument to the technological peak of the Greenskins race, a gargantuan engine of ruin, that overrides the once fabled Ullanor crusade to a distant dusty memory. Unlike the crude rocks utilised by the lesser warbands of today, these planetoids were not merely asteroids propelled by engines, but hollowed-out celestial bodies transformed into the sophisticated vessels of planetary extinction. At the height of the beast's reign in the 32nd millennia, these constructs utilised the mastery of physics that mocked the limitations of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They were capable of near-instantaneous interstellar travel by a method of subspace displacement, bypassing the treacherous tides of the warp entirely, and allowing the green tide to manifest anywhere in the galaxy with little to no warning. The exterior of these moons was a chaotic, impenetrable crust of fused wreckage and interlocking metal plates, forming a shell so dense that the most powerful kinetic barrages from macro cannons or directed energy beams of the Imperial Navy were rendered utterly inconsequential. Yet this mass was not inert. The surface was a living mechanism of shutters the size of inland seas, and mountain range sizes of tectonic plates, all engineered to shift and reform into the stylized, terrifying visage of an orc face. This mask was more than aesthetics. The plates would move in eerie synchronization, mimicking the oratory of the great beast himself within. When the moon spoke, its magmatic eyes burned with the stolen heat of a planetary core, and its tusked maw would extend to the size of a continent, disgorging swarms of warships and transports from the moon's hollowed heart. The arrival of an attack moon was, in itself, an act of total war. By somehow manipulating the laws of subspace, these planetoids could manifest far closer to a target world than the traditional laws of celestial mechanics would permit. The sudden displacement of a mass caused an immediate, cataclysmic disruption of the planet's gravity field. Tidal forces would tear at the crust, oceans would boil over into the sky, and hive cities would be ground to dust by the sheer proximity of the Orkoid moon. These moons would materialize within the very atmosphere of their prey, emerging so close to the surface that the vacuum of space was bridged by its own artificial environment, allowing the booming roar of the great beast to travel directly from the moon's metallic maw to the ears of the doomed below. It was a heraldry of noise and gravitic destruction that signalled not just an invasion, but total annihilation at the hands of the greenskin. On the surface of Adamantia, the same herald of the green tide was heard echoing across the entire planet. As the Imperial Fist waged a hopeless war against both the pant chromes and the escalating tectonic ruptures caused by the moon's unnatural gravity, the Orks descended in a scale unseen. They fell upon the Imperial and Chrome forces with clinical, terrifying efficiency. Of the entire Imperial Fist strength deployed to the surface, the toll was near absolute. Only 4 survivors were recovered, and 3 of those would succumb to their horrific wounds while under the desperate failing ministrations of the Adeptus Mechanicus, for no tech priest or apothecary survived, nor any of their precious gene seed recovered. When the dust finally settled in the wake of their retreat, only 1 Imperial Fist remained to hold the line. Second Captain Corland, of the Daylight Wall Company, found himself, by the grim and hollow mathematics of war, the de facto chapter master of the Praetorians of Terra, the last son of a shattered legion. In orbit, the tragedy was much the same. As it reached its zenith, Lord Commander Militant Heth's fleet was reduced to glittering atoms by the attack moon's primary weaponry. Before his destruction, Heth managed to transmit a final, desperate astropathic warning to Terra, a cry into the dark declaring that mankind now faced a threat without precedent. The strategos of the throne world could only reach one chilling conclusion as they interpreted the incoming dreams of the astropaths. The attack moon was not merely a stationary fortress, but a mobile engine of extinction. Its trajectory was fixed, its hunger was insatiable, and its target was the cradle of humanity itself. In the agonizing solar month that followed, the true scale of this catastrophe revealed itself like a slow-spreading poison. It became hideously apparent to the Imperium that Adamantia was a single drop in the rising ocean of the green tide. Multiple Ork attack moons had materialized across Segmentum Solar, acting as gravitational anchors for the unstoppable tide of unusually massive greenskins. Entire systems were swallowed whole, followed by subsectors, and eventually full sectors were overrun by a war of such magnitude that the warp itself seemed to scream in sympathetic resonance as the mass killings and their then unknown transportation method causing havoc with the established warp routes. billions of Imperial citizens perished in the wake of these rising tide, while others, broken by the psychic and gravitic storms trailing the moons, descended into madness or formed desperate blasphemous cults dedicated to the worship of the great beast. Their pathetic pleas for mercy, that they cried upon the planetoid invading their very atmosphere, its orkoid face looming over them like the gods of old, availed them nothing. They were slaughtered, with the same clinical indifference as those who remained loyal to the throne. In contrast, within the gilded halls of the Militarum Imperialis, the High Lords of Terra proved themselves as ineffective as they were arrogant. They descended into a spiral of political bickering, more concerned with their own standing and political survival, rather than survival of the Imperium and the countless lives within their care. In the annuals of Imperial betrayal, few acts of cowardice are as polished or as politically calculated as that of High Lord Admiral Langsung during the opening months of the Beast's invasion. While the galaxy burned and the Sons of Dawn were ground into the dust at Adamantia, Langsung saw not a catastrophe to be averted, but a vacuum of power to be filled. With the death of the Lord Commander Militant Heth, the Supreme Commander of the Astra Militarum, Langsung did not mourn a fallen comrade in arms. Instead, he utilised Heth's demise as a convenient shroud to mask his own staggering failures. By casting the blame for the disaster onto the hasty and ill-prepared rescue mission, led by the deceased Lord Commander and supported by the Master of Assassins, Langsung eventually turned a military slaughter into a political escape route. His refusal to coordinate with the Astra Militarum was a move of naked, trembling self-interest. He withdrew the might of the Imperial Navy, the Glaskian Gulf, hoarding the Segmentum's remaining strength like a mitre gold. In his twisted logic, if the Grand Forces were left to bleed without naval support, their inevitable failures would only serve to highlight the necessity of his own fleet and consolidate his grip over the Militarum Imperialis. In the archives viewed, it is stated that in the personal journals of the various Navy officers at the time, Langsung operated under the lethal delusion that he could bargain with the tides of fate. He believed that by preserving his ships, he was preserving his leverage, failing to realise that a Lord High Admiral of a dead Imperium is the master of nothing but ash. You sit atop the bridge of his pride, watching the horizon for political rivals while the rising damp of the orkoid threat became a crashing green tide that cared nothing for his excuses or his rank. For Langsung, the survival of the Imperium was secondary to the survival of his own authority. Amidst this paralysing lack of leadership, Draken von Gorich, the aforementioned Grand Master of Assassins, attempted to navigate this political rot. These clandestine investigations, however, unearthed a discovery that chilled even his iron heart. Evidence of Adeptus Mechanicus forces moving within the wake of the orkoid advance. Their agenda remained a dark enigma, and it was recorded by his own writings that von Gorich vowed to pierce the veil of the machine gods, and more importantly the fabricated generals' silence on the matter. While the Masters of Terra played at politics, the heirs of the 7th Legion turned to the ancient laws of blood and brotherhood. High Marshal Beaumont of the Black Templars, a wearer of unyielding zeal, undertook a perilous quest through the encroaching darkness to gather the scattered heirs of Rogel Dawn. The site of this unusual reunion would be the Foul System, a site steeped in the 7th Legion's ancient martial history and a subject for its own chronicle, for it had once been the stage of an elaborate trap designed to keep the Legion isolated during the heresy. But here amongst the echoes of their past, a hushed assembly gathered. In the shadows of the void, representatives from the Crimson Fist, the Excoriators, the Fist Exemplar and the Iron Knights stood in grim formation. At the centre of this gathering stood Corland, the last son of Dawn. As the only living, breathing heir of the Imperial Fist Legion, Corland possessed a terrible and singular authority. He reached back across the millennia of separation and invoked the Last Wall Protocol. This was no mere alliance. It was a ghost of the Great Crusade. Established by Rogel Dawn himself during the Dark Bays following the Horus Heresy, the Protocol was a contingency designed for the utter end of all things. It dictated that should Terra face mortal peril, or should the palace itself fall, the successor chapters of his lineage were to cast aside their disparate heraldry and reform the united 7th Legion of old. The mandate was clear. Even if the Imperial Fists as a chapter were to be erased from the rolls of the living, Their successors would shoulder the burden of the daylight wall as a single unstoppable fist. Though the soul drinkers remained silent and unreachable in the deep void, the others did not hesitate. In that moment, the second founding was effectively undone by necessity. The Scions of Dawn stood as one once more, a legion reborn in the 11th hour to stand against the beast, proving that while a single stone may be ground to dust, the wall itself remains eternal. In the end, the history of the War of the Beast is not merely a record of military conquest, but a damning indictment to the price of peace. It began with the image of the rat and the rising flood, a metaphor for the instinctual survival of the lowly versus the suicidal arrogance of the highborn. As the waters of the green tide rose to swallow the segmentum solar, we saw that metaphor manifest in the cold metallic terror of the chromes and the staggering criminal vanity of the High Lords. The Imperium had forgotten that the galaxy is a predator, and that the time of rebirth was but a fleeting reprieve. It took the literal unmaking of a world and the near extinction of a legion to pierce the veil of human hubris. As we close the pages of history upon this era, we find ourselves looking on an age where the High Lords bicker over the seating charts of the table, the needs and the desperate wants of the lives under their privileged care being forgotten. The invocation of the Last War Protocol serves as a final sombre reflection. It is the ultimate admission of failure and the ultimate testament of duty. The titles, the ranks, the admiralties and the senates collapse under the weight of their own corruption. Only the foundational bonds of brotherhood remain. But now the wall is rebuilt, but the foundations are soaked in the blood of billions. The War of the Beast has only just begun. And until my next chapter upon this era, remember, knowledge is power. Got it well. And so this record may now be sealed in the Emperor's name. To appease the algorithmic machine spirit and ensure it recognises your service, register your credentials or preferred seal in the comments below. Your feedback and support is genuinely appreciated. I would like to extend my never-ending gratitude to my Patreon subscribers, a sentence I never would have thought I would ever get to say. To join those most noble master scholars, visit patreon.com/Historitor Corbe Moore. Keep this transmission array running and sacred vellum fresh. Or you can join me on Twitter or TikTok at @MoreCorvo. The links, as ever, are in the details below. But our work never ends. Your clearance has been extended to the next prioritised file appearing on your boxcast now. Proceed onwards, dearest listener, for our vigil continues. I shall join you in the next one.